Good afternoon to everyone in the United States, at least on the East Coast time zone. Good evening to our friends and colleagues in Europe, and welcome to everyone, no matter where you are, for this webinar. I'm Jeff Rathke, president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at Johns Hopkins University. We are just a couple of days beyond the September 26th election to the German Bundestag, an election that I think is momentous, but still inconclusive. Momentous because we know that it marks the start of a new epoch in Germany's political history. But it's inconclusive because we don't know yet what government will emerge to take that forward. We can say, though, I think with some confidence, that whatever government is formed will be one without precedent in post-war German party politics. And that's why it's especially timely to have this discussion today. I'm going to turn things over to Eric Langenbacher, who is a Senior Fellow and the Director of the AICGS Program on Society, Culture, and Politics. But before I do, I just want to say how proud we are to have been part of this series, which will continue after today's session. It's not the end, don't worry. But I want to thank the Aston Center for Europe, the International Association for the Study of German Politics, and the BMW Center for German and European Studies at Georgetown University. And especially thanks to Eric for his leadership in this series. So with that, let me turn the floor over to you, and we will get right down to it and hear more about the impact that this election is going to have on Germany, on Europe, and on the transatlantic relationship.
Thanks, Jeff. I should add that I've worked really closely with Ed Turner at the International Association for the Study of German Politics, and this has been a true collaboration. So I also want to kind of thank everyone for participating and helping to organize things. So there's a lot that we need to talk about today. I'm really happy that we have three superb panelists that will be sharing their thoughts. We're going to start with Ed Turner, who's a reader at politics at Aston University, based in the Aston Center for Europe, that's in Birmingham, England. He's published extremely widely and is currently working on the SPD. So, you know, how serendipitous. Then we're going to have Chantal Sullivan-Thomsett, who's a PhD researcher at the University of Leeds, who's working on a really fascinating dissertation on contemporary German Green Party, the German Green Party, member activism, and the relationship between institutional and extra-institutional involvement in protests. And then we're going to have Marcel Lewandowsky, who's a DAD visiting assistant professor at the Center for European Studies at the University of Florida. His research and teaching focuses on comparative politics, but especially parties and party systems and populism. And he's taught at several universities in Germany. So we have three just great perspectives that we'll share in just a moment. But before I hand the floor over, I thought it would be useful to go over some of the outcomes of the election on Sunday. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly. Here we go. So here are the second vote results, the kind of all-important votes. And, you know, these proportions might change as they complete their count. One of the things that was interesting about this election was the high number of mail ballots. I think I heard estimates of 40%, which is much higher than they've had in previous years. So there's that. But as of our most current count, the SPD has won with 25.7, so just a shade below 26%. The CDU's in at CDU-CSU, the union parties, are at 24%, which frankly is a little higher than they were polling in the last weeks of the campaign. So that's definitely an interpretable fact. The Greens came in just under 15%, which frankly, I think is a bit of a disappointment given how high they were in the polls. And even in the last surveys, they were 16, 15%. The FDP did slightly better than last time, 11.3%. The AfD did much worse. Well, I guess it's a glass half empty, glass half full issue, coming in at 10.3%. And the left missed the 5% threshold, coming in at 4.9%. But they got 3 constituencies, so they're eligible for 4.9% of the overall allocation. So these are the vote totals. I would also point out that despite having, 6 options to vote for, almost 9% of the electorate still chose other parties. So that is also something to kind of take into consideration. All right, if we look at the distribution of seats, and again, this might change slightly, but it looks like the Bundestag is going to have 735 members. So that's more than the 709 that they had last time. But this is also a big issue, which perhaps we'll return to in a future webinar. This XXL Bundestag, which will cost millions and millions more to have. So 735 seats, so a majority is 368. And you can see that the SPD will have the biggest caucus at about 206 members. The Union Party's at 196, AFD at 83, which is less than last time. I think they had 94 in the last Bundestag. 92 go to the FDP, 39 to the left, 118 to the Greens, and this minority party in Schleswig-Holstein, which represents the Danish minority, got 1 seat. And I think that's a first, actually, at least in the Bundestag. They've been in the Landtag in that state for a while. So then that brings us to the coalitions. And now the real hard work is going to happen. I mean, we thought that the election was interesting, but I think the next few weeks and months will be just as, if not more interesting. And so, as you can see, there are 5 coalitions that are mathematically possible. The first 2, I think you can just discount because, you know, you would have a grand coalition that would have more than enough for a majority. So what would be the point of diluting power and sharing with the Greens or the FDP? So I don't think those are real options. So there's really 3 options. I think, you know, maybe 4 people in all of Germany want another grand coalition. So I really think that this last option is not that likely. So it's really going to be a question of whether it's a traffic light or an Ampel coalition, or whether it's a Jamaica coalition, of course, corresponding to the colors of that country's flag and the colors of the various parties as they've traditionally been denoted. I think a lot of people are leaning towards a traffic light coalition as probably being the most likely, especially because the SPD, as the largest party in the Bundestag, will have the right to form a government first. But it's possible that we'll have all sorts of Machiavellian maneuvers, especially by the FDP. So we might get a Jamaica after all. But you know, if that's true, then this will be the first time in post-war German history that there's a 3-party coalition. I mean, yeah, there were smaller parties that were with Adenauer and the CDU in the 1950s. I don't think those really count, to be honest. So it will definitely be a new situation. All right, so with that introduction, I will conclude, and I'm going to hand it over first to Ed Turner. Ed, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much indeed. And Eric, thanks very much for the kind words about the collaboration. I mean, one thing we've certainly learned in this pandemic is how to use Zoom. And I think that's shown us on both sides of the Atlantic, really, how much more we can achieve when we do things together. So I'm quite certain that this sort of lesson will outlive the pandemic era. And I'm incredibly optimistic about the amount of virtual and then also in-person collaboration which will be possible in the future. I was asked particularly to say a few words about the two main parties, or perhaps 3 if you count the CSU amongst it. I'll try and keep it quite crunchy so that we've got plenty of time for discussion, and just also a couple of predictions or thoughts on what might happen next. So I'm very often wrong about these things, so take loads of salt with them. I mean, the really big story of this election, it seems to me, over the last few months is the remarkable transformation of the SPD's standing, the sort of, for those who speak German, the Aufholjagd, the catch-up par excellence. I mean, what's behind it? Clearly, we're all a bit clever after the event, and probably Markus Söder, if he'd been the candidate, would have got a much better result for the CDU-CSU, and then we would have carried on with the crisis of social democracy narrative. So, you know, the one thing which the SPD had was the right opponent, and we'll come on to that in a second. But in terms of things which really worked for them, I mean, they had a strong chancellor candidate, no question, who gave voters what they were after. A year ago, talking to social democrats, quite often people would say, when Angela Merkel's not a candidate anymore, when people realise that she's stepping down, they'll be looking for someone to offer the same sort of qualities, and Olaf Scholz to be in the right place at the right time. I think maybe some people, including those close to Scholz, really did believe it, but for many, it was just kind of a forced narrative that was sort of, hope dies last kind of view, and they didn't really believe it. But that really was what came about. Scholz was seen to have qualities that people associated with Merkel, who of course remains Germany's most popular politician. And I think also, of course, this was an unusual election in not having an incumbent chancellor standing for re-election, and we all know in German elections there tends to be an incumbency bonus, and so if there's going to be an incumbency bonus and there's no chancellor, well, maybe the vice chancellor and a very prominent finance minister gets that incumbency bonus as well. So that possibly helped, and certainly it flipped around the relationship we've seen in previous years, where the junior partner in a grand coalition has tended to be punished. I think another sort of related point was that the party's manifesto was decent. It was crisper and clearer than some of the previous efforts. The campaign was also very sound. And certainly there was a stronger relationship with the SPD's party apparatus. You know, the SPD's notoriously divided sometimes. That was very much in evidence in previous elections and also in between times. Andrea Nahles, previous leader, who of course was forced out after the European elections, actually played her part by healing some of the divisions over the Hartz reforms to welfare, which had been a real bugbear for the SPD and really fueled the crisis. I think also the pandemic had an effect, because it meant that rather than resenting Olaf Scholz's approach as finance minister, being against new debt and very focused on the Schwarze Null, balanced budgets, instead that reputation went. It was kind of forced by events, and instead Olaf Scholz was delivering economic, big spending, the big bazooka. Also, perhaps people say maybe there's a bit of post hoc rationalisation here, but the fact that he lost the party's leadership to relatively unknown left-wing candidates, meant that the left were more sort of bound in. And lastly, Scholz didn't distance himself from the party. You think back, for example, to Per Steinbrück as chancellor candidate. He tended to sort of say, look, I'm different from the SPD. Scholz didn't really do that, and that was quite interesting, and so instead became more associated with the party label. By contrast, the other really big story is the CDU-CSU's extraordinary collapse to their worst results in history. And I emphasise both party names because it does seem that really certainly ever since the conflict over Germany's borders in the summer of 2018, arguments between CDU and CSU have become the kind of new Dauerzustand, the new normal, and it looks like that's been carrying on today as well. I made a bad judgment in the run-up to the election. I remember doing a round like this just before and saying Armin Laschet has been consistently underestimated, and people shouldn't underestimate him. After all, here was someone who defeated a popular SPD incumbent in his home state, someone who managed to see off Friedrich Merz for the party leadership, and then see off Markus Söder. But that really didn't work, and in particular in crisis management, he just had an absolute shocker, particularly at the time of the floods. And if voters already had their doubts about him, the campaign did everything possible to confirm them. It was underprepared as well. Suddenly releasing in weeks before the election a whole load of new policy pledges, had absolutely no time to settle, looked like an act of desperation. We'll talk about the smaller parties later, but I think this opened up space in all directions, and particularly for the FDP. And what I think we'll see now is the CDU-CSU turning in on itself, the sort of generally Selbstverfleischung, that there's going to be a real internal battle. We've already seen it this afternoon, actually, with a tussle over who's going to lead the parliamentary group and how long for, and so they're going to have to rebuild and also decide on future strategic positioning. I mean, my hunch is they will probably opt for a more squarely conservative agenda if they end up in opposition. Lastly, what next? Again, I shouldn't make predictions, but I find it really hard to imagine there'll be a Jamaica coalition. The CDU-CSU is not an attractive prospect to lead a government at the moment. In real disarray, some of its people already saying, look, we can't really go there. questionable legitimation if they come up with someone other than Laschet to be Chancellor. Laschet kind of looking like a real loser and someone who's not wanted. If you look at all the polling, Germans want Scholz to be Chancellor rather than Laschet, and it'd be a really hard sell for the Green grassroots to say let's put Laschet or even Markus Söder into the Chancellery. The FDP have to keep other options in play for leverage, but it's really hard to see it happening. So I think the most likely outcome will be a traffic light coalition being formed, and I'll leave it there and pass back to Eric.
And I will pass it on to Chantal.
Thank you very much, Ed and Eric. So I, no surprise, will be talking a bit about the Greens, and then hopefully talk about a few areas where there could be sticking points or common ground between the Greens and the FDP. So if you were to just take the numbers that Eric put up at the start of the Green result, this is their best ever result. They were the party that gained the most in vote share this year. But that would be a very simplistic way of reading those numbers. And it was a mixed bag in terms of that this was a good result, but it wasn't the result that they were expecting or that they were fighting for, as has already been alluded to. This was the first election that they put forward a Chancellor candidate, and that was because since late 2018, in opinion polls, but also in state elections, particularly in the West and in the European elections in 2019, the Greens were consistently seeming to get 20% of the votes. You know, in the European elections, they were second behind the CDU. There was a real feeling that actually they could come on top or even second. And this continued, and when Annalena Baerbock, the eventual candidate, was chosen, there was a further surge in the opinion polls, around about 27%, and they were coming in first. So there's all this hype, very, very exciting, but didn't play out like that. It seems that the Greens made a lot of mistakes in their campaign. There wasn't a sufficient amount of preparation for the kind of intense scrutiny that Baerbock, as the Chancellor candidate, was going to experience. Maybe naively thinking that this could be an election that was more about values, when most likely it was always going to be about people, given that it's Merkel who is standing down and it's looking for who's following Merkel. So she was beset by plagiarism accusations, by not filing taxes for a Christmas bonus in time, inaccuracies on her CV, and although she apologized for these quite quickly, this wasn't taken well, given that she hasn't had governing experience, even though she's been in the Bundestag since 2013. But I don't want to leave you with the impression, which a lot of people have, that it's totally down to Annalena Baerbock that the Greens didn't do as well as they would like, but did quite well. You know, there was a difficulty in selling over this energy money, Energiegeld, that was meant to balance out the financial impact on poorer groups in society of an increase in carbon dioxide pricing. But if you can't afford an electric car, €75 per head to help you fill your tank one time a year probably isn't going to help you much. So that those kind of things didn't work in their favor. But what did work in their favor was the general interest in climate policy and climate protection. They were the party that attracted the most new voters, with the FDP close behind, and they will have a parliamentary party with 16 direct mandates, which previously the Greens only ever had one. So that is a great success, even in Munich, in metropolitan cities, but in cities that they previously haven't had that kind of representation. And it's a much younger and female parliamentary party. So it'll be really interesting to see where that goes, particularly with the judgment, at least today, that that is a generally more left-wing parliamentary group, and whether that could cause issues between the party leadership, which has put on a very united front, and the new parliamentary party. In terms of coalition building now, we saw from election night that there seemed to be a sort of understanding that the Greens and the FDP would negotiate together before talking to the SPD or the CDU. And this is an interesting prospect. Now I've had a little bit more time to think about it myself. Together, they are larger than, they have a larger vote share than the SPD, so there may be a strength in numbers. And Cem Özdemir has said that in doing this before going into negotiations with the two bigger parties, actually this could be a strategy to stop them playing the FDP and the Greens against each other. And as we saw with the attempted Jamaica coalitions, that was the reason, whether it was true, that was the reason Christian Lindner gave for walking out on it, that the Greens were getting more preferential treatment than the FDP. So that's certainly an interesting strategy to go, and it's not unusual for the two to coalesce together. There's a Jamaica coalition in Schleswig-Holstein and a traffic light coalition in Rheinland-Pfalz. And I also think that the traffic light is more likely. I think personally, that's what would be better for Germany. The union needs to go into opposition. But it'll be interesting, given that Annalena Baerbock seemed to indicate quite a few times in the election campaign of a preference to work with Scholz. And Robert Habeck's experience with Jamaica when he was in the Schleswig-Holstein state parliament in negotiating Jamaica there, and what might win out between those two. And the big sticking points between the FDP and Greens as a final point is going to be how they can reconcile themselves between the Greens' stance on climate protection and the FDP's stance on economic policy. The Greens need quite a lot of financial investment to do their climate strategies, and the FDP don't want to raise taxes or touch the debt brake Schuldenbremse. So that's a bit of a sticking point. And there may be some ways through that. So we'll just have to watch this space, but certainly it's an interesting few months ahead. Back to you, Eric.
All right. I mean, that's for sure. And it's probably a good step that the Greens and the FDP are having, I guess, mini Sondierungsgespräche. So informal chats to work out their own issues before they go and negotiate with Schulz, or I guess perhaps maybe with Laschet. All right, but next we have Marcel.
Thank you so much for having me. Just a few words first on possible future coalitions. I was surprised by how fast this is going right now, because at an election night, there were two and a half possible coalitions being in play, which was Traffic Light, Jamaica, and Grand Coalition. And now it all comes down to a traffic light coalition. And it's kind of funny to see that at first the Greens and the FDP have tried to keep that a little more open, but now they're forced to negotiate into that direction. And I think that is due to two reasons. First of all, FDP and Greens, as much as other parties, are not unitary actors. You have more progressive factions within the FDP. You have more conservative factions within the Greens. On the one hand, and the other factor is, in my opinion, the performance of Armin Laschet. Armin Laschet is extremely weak right now. Also, the compromise on the election of the party group leader in parliament of Brinkhaus has bought him some time, but actually it doesn't really help him. I think we're looking at a traffic light coalition, but that is still a lot of speculation in play. What I would like to do at this point is to broaden the perspective a little more and include the smallest parties or the fringe parties in Germany, which is the left and the AfD. So oftentimes referred to as populist parties, populist left and populist right, which is not entirely true for the left, but very true for the AfD. I'd like to start with that party first. So it's kind of interesting to see that the AfD is pretty much stagnating. It remained, it lost a little, but it pretty much is still above 10%. It's about, I think, 10.6% right now, maybe a little more. But still, that was expected within the party. And you could see in their press conference after the election that there's a split going through the party that has always been there. There are just times when it's more or less visible, and now it's very visible after that result. And that is between the radicals and those who are forming intra-party coalitions with those radicals. That will be Kupala and Weidel, the two frontrunners of the party, and those who are often referred to as being more moderate, which means that they're radical right, but not anti-democratic. And that will be Jörg Meuthen. You can see that there's pretty much a split going on. So there are two questions in place here. Why did this happen to the AfD, and where is the AfD going from here? So I think overall what we have seen in the longer perspective with the AfD is that their electorate has pretty much become a fortress. And that happened with the radicalization of the AfD in the last years. So the AfD is able to attract those voters who are too radical, too disappointed, also are too populist in terms of their attitudes to vote for any other party that is more centrist or even left-wing, but they're unable to attract voters that are more moderate. So they're pretty much stuck with their electorate. Also, when it comes to situational factors, the AfD lacked a topic. It tried to extend its crisis narrative that it first played out in the Euro crisis, then in the refugee crisis, and now it tried to extend it, as I said, to the pandemic. But that didn't work out because the pandemic wasn't a topic at this point, one aspect. Second aspect, the FDP pretty much also presented itself as the defender of freedom against, quote unquote, right, defenders of freedom against the anti-corona measures by the government. But at the same time, the FDP wasn't as shrill as anti-democratic as the AfD, which pretty much framed the whole thing as a dictatorship being installed by the government. That was the talking point, the main talking point of the AfD in the pandemic, and that didn't work out with more moderate voters. So what is going to happen with the AfD, I believe, is that, ironically, those factions within the party that are more radical are going to demand more say. Why is that? That is because those were the constituencies and the regions of Germany, not whole East Germany, but the south of East Germany, Saxony, and the southern parts of Thuringia, in which the AfD was able to win constituencies and was able to become the biggest party in these states overall. And these are the more radical branches. So they will claim that their strategy worked out and a more moderate strategy won't. And we're looking at interesting weeks and months to come within the AfD. When it comes to the left, just to keep this very short, I think the left was suffering from a long-term factor, and that is the left was unable to present itself as a left alternative, especially for younger voters. That is the Greens. The Greens are the party of the younger left voters. It's not the left party. The left has has had a stable electorate over the years. These were older voters in the East. These voters are, well, in fact, they're dying, and the left is unable to attract new voters. Also, the left is internally split. This is why I'm always a little reluctant to say it's a populist party. Yes, it uses populism. Yes, it has populist factions, but they're more moderate factions, and they're extremists. And the left was split over many topics, including the coronavirus. So overall, it embraced a supportive and moderate approach, but it was unable to present itself with a platform. With a concise platform is what I'm saying. So overall, I think that the left might see future decline, but we will have to look at that in the weeks to come, because there will be disruptive effects within that party as well.
All right, thanks so much. Just a couple of other points on the AfD, if I may. So they also got 16 direct mandates, exactly the same number that the Greens got, all in Eastern Germany. They swept almost all of Saxony, except for some of the cities like Dresden, Leipzig, and Chemnitz, I think. And they're making inroads into Thuringia, and I think they got 1 or 2 in Saxony-Anhalt as well. So yeah, if you break down the second vote total, the AfD came in second in Eastern Germany with 19.1% of the vote. And in West Germany, they had only 8.2% of the vote. So that's something that I've been thinking and observing for a while, that the AfD is increasingly becoming Easternized and might be taking up the mantle that the left party used to have as the kind of Eastern identity politics party. So I think that's also one of the kind of important dimensions to look at. All right, so we can now kind of pivot into the Q&A. So I would ask all participants, if you could please type into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and then I will read off the questions to our panelists. I should also, by the way, note that 3 of the 4 faces that you're seeing on this just got back from a study tour in Berlin in the days before and then on election day. So, you know, we have quite a few interesting observations I'm sure that we could share from that terrific program that we had. All right, waiting for questions. All right, well, you know, maybe I'll pose a couple then, if I may. So, kind of a question for Chantal. I mean, I think that you really captured this kind of divided mood about the Greens. Yes, on the one hand, they had record gains and a record kind of outcome, but you know, my feeling is that this actually was experienced more as a disappointment because they were riding so high in the polls. The other thing I would note too is this is not the first time that we've seen this story, right? I mean, it was the 2013 election, I think, where they were riding high 6 months or a year before polling, and then they just absolutely kind of collapsed. So I almost want to say, well, I guess that's 2 data points, so not quite a pattern, but it seems to be a bit of a pattern. And I think that you're right. And we also heard from some people on the ground in Berlin that, yeah, there were problems with their campaign. They weren't prepared. But I'm like, this is not the first time that they've been. I remember one year they had like eco posters like that literally melted in the rain, and that was taken as a metaphor for their campaign. So, you know, why do you think they've had such problems professionalizing their campaign?
Thanks, Eric. That's a really good question. I think that the candidate factor and the focus on Baerbock may have had an issue just because the kind of rise in the polls has been part of this united Green front and a united party, and that has worked well for them. Of course, with the Greens, it's always that delegates have to vote on the manifestos. There's a lot of amendments that get made, and a lot of local party branches make sure that their factions are represented in those delegates or stand as candidates. So there may have been, what has happened in previous years is that you can have a pragmatic figure or 2 figureheads in the past selling some more left-wing policies that ultimately hurt the wealthy urban voters who tend to vote for the Greens. So that's a bit of a pattern, that maybe come election day, you vote with your wallet in mind rather than your environmental conscience.
All right, so I'm starting to see some of these questions. There's a great question here about Maaßen, who's this kind of far right yet still CDU politician that used to run the Bundesverfassungsschutz, and it was a very controversial person in the party. So he lost his direct mandate, I think against a triathlete, a very famous kind of like athlete. There also were, just to kind of, I guess, piggyback on that question, several other rather prominent politicians that also lost their constituencies, including this Philipp Amthor from that's Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, and a couple of others. So do any of our panelists have any kind of comments on that? Marcel, maybe you, because the Maassen, AFD kind of politician. So maybe you'd like to take that.
Well, to comment on Maassen, I think it's an interesting example for which strategies do not work under certain circumstances against the radical right? So we're also discussing in research about which strategies work to contain the radical right. And oftentimes, especially, and we can also see that in international comparison, conservative parties try to shift to the right, occupy their space, and then present a viable alternative to radical right voters. That does not work. What you could see, well, sometimes it works, but in that case, it did not. Because what you could see is that the radical right vote overall didn't really change. And the AFD voters remained relatively stable with their party, which also speaks to the fact that these voters are less available to the mainstream parties, including the CDU, than voters of other parties. And at the same time, since you were able to gain voters from that party, other parties, democratic parties, were able to mobilize and then win. This is what we saw with the SPD. So I think especially Maassen is a great example for shifting to the right, not necessarily working out, especially for conservative parties, in order to tackle the right-wing populist vote. But I still believe that after this election, if the CDU-CSU ends up in a position, and I agree with Ed here, I guess, there will be discussions about the ideology of the CDU, and there will be demands to position it more on the right.
We're starting to get a bunch of questions about policy implications, especially from a traffic light coalition. So in particular, how do you think, let's assume for a second that it is a traffic light, that Scholz is the chancellor. What do our panelists think the impact's going to be, especially at the European level, in terms of integration, in terms of shared debt, in terms of defense, and perhaps more kind of European coordination when it comes to that? Ed, do you want to maybe take a first stab at that kind of big, massive question?
Yeah, it's what I've been thinking about a lot, though. I think it's really interesting. So, and if I may, I'll weave in one or two of the other sort of points which have been raised in a Q&A on Europe. First base is the SPD and the Greens are really quite well aligned, but the FDP is in a very different place. And I guess particularly if the FDP takes the finance ministry, then in terms of expanding arrangements for shared debt, that's difficult to impossible. Of course, also the Federal Constitutional Court will be watching events in this area quite closely as well. That's going to be really quite difficult. Equally, there will be limits to what the FDP would be able to block for a couple of reasons. One is that big European questions, the Chancellery has a big say, as it does on big foreign policy questions as well. One reason why I expect relative continuity there. Also, the other member states of the European Union will have something to do with what happens as well, and so I would think developments will be incremental, but you couldn't rule them out. And also, frankly, some of the parameters already set down. So the MFF will outlast Linde's term as finance minister if he were a one-term finance minister, and also the nuts and bolts of the recovery package are in place. So I don't think you'll see a massive expansion. I don't think you'll see the EU turning into a kind of more redistributive mechanism under Christian Lindner if he's the finance minister or the FDP and the coalition, but it probably won't roll things back. And just in terms of Macron and Scholz, if that's the way it plays out, Scholz was in the driving seat in developing the recovery fund as finance minister. And Scholz is an adept negotiator. I think he won't be making the kind of visionary speeches that we can look forward to from Emmanuel Macron, but I certainly don't see him kind of ceding leadership in that sense. I think that would be downplaying it. So that's where I'll leave it, if I may.
Any other thoughts from Chantal or Marcel on that particular policy implication? Maybe we can talk a little bit more about policy and or foreign policy in particular. Do we have any thoughts, or do we have any inside information on who we think is going to be the foreign minister or the defense minister? And with the Greens likely in the next government, well, it's almost certain they're going to be in the next government. They've taken a much stronger stance on human rights as a component of foreign policy, especially vis-a-vis China with the Uyghurs. Nobody talks about Tibet anymore, but we probably should, Hong Kong and many other things. And then also, of course, Russia. They have really been against the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, but with looming gas shortages in Europe, we'll see if they continue that kind of hard stance in the next few months when the weather gets cold. But what do we think about personnel in those important kind of, foreign facing ministries? And if there are going to be any, policy shifts?
I mean, I can dive in a little bit on those, but welcome others' comments. I don't have much to say on the personnel. I look forward to Chantal speculating. I guess maybe Cem Özdemir might come into the frame, or Annalena Baerbock if there's a Green Foreign Minister. But honestly, I think there's a limit to how much it will matter, because I just think the Chancellery will track it quite closely. So yes, you would expect with a traffic light coalition a slight change in a more hawkish direction on Russia and China, but I don't think you're going to be seeing. I think it'll be evolutionary rather than revolutionary. Obviously, depends on what those countries do, and whether there are any outrageous acts or anything like that. I mean, other bits to watch. I think defence exports will be an interesting one as well. That's going to be interesting, and the coalition agreement will have to say something about that. I think you move further away from Germany meeting the 2% NATO target. That would be, for various reasons, probably quite a challenge, and I suspect might back away a little bit there. Be interesting, just as an aside as well, to see where Rolf Mützenich, the SPD's floor leader, ends up, whether he carries on in that role. I mean, he's someone that would be, is pretty dovish on Russian questions, and certainly also quite concerned about the defence industry. So it'd just be quite interesting to see what profile he has. And just on the EU army stuff, just one, maybe it doesn't help here. I think a lot of people are interested in the German relationship with France and its approach to Emmanuel Macron's positioning. The one which people aren't talking about as much is the relationship with Warsaw. But Poland will be, I think, in a different place when it comes to European strategic autonomy versus kind of working harder on the transatlantic front and throwing a lot in with NATO, and they may be complementary, but it'll be really quite interesting to see how Berlin-Warsaw shapes up and what balance is found there.
Chantal, would you like to weigh in on foreign policy, especially if the Greens get the foreign ministry?
Sure. I mean, we know that the Greens at least have a little bit of previous with the foreign ministry a while ago now, but with Joschka Fischer, and certainly it wasn't uncontroversial. I think the pacifism debate is a long foregone thing. That won't necessarily play an issue other than a reluctance for military force, if at all possible, and a larger focus, as you say, on human rights. Personnel wise, I think Cem Özdemir would be a very good shout. I have read today that there's a bit of a rumor that Annalena Baerbock and Habeck have kind of agreed ministries between themselves, which is not going down particularly well. And as we heard also this week, that Lindner and Habeck might be fighting for the finance ministry. So maybe Habeck would end up in the foreign ministry if Lindner got his way. It'd certainly be an interesting prospect. What I would be quite interested to see if it came into play at all was that in this redrafting of their party principles that they've done within the Greens over the last 3 or 4 years, that came out last year, sorry, it's a 2-year that became a 3-year because of the pandemic. They still are on this Fisher idea of a federalized Europe as sort of the ideal, and more federalization within the European project. But they also talked about the idea of feminist foreign policy and moving away from military, kind of the focus on military and violence in that way. So, I mean, party principles are just a sort of ideological document more so than anything else, but I think it would be interesting to see if there were any principles that they might bring in from that kind of camp as well.
Great. You know, there's some questions here about like voting movement. There's one question about how the constituencies that were affected by the flooding voted. I was just looking at the map, and it seems that they voted predominantly CDU, maybe a couple of SPD here, but they did not go for the Greens in the more kind of rural areas in those places. So that's kind of interesting. And then here's one about voter movement, right? And, you know, the SPD was up over 5%. So where do these voters come from? Where do the disappointed CDU voters go? Actually, I remember seeing one of those graphics where a lot of the CDU voters in 2017 have unfortunately passed away. So that's always kind of an issue. Sometimes I think that Germany is the only country where when you're doing actual analyses, they show, well, how many people died that, you know, used to vote for pictures, but I don't know, maybe that says something about the demographic situation. But Marcel, do you maybe want to take that one and, you know, share some thoughts about how voters shifted between 2017 and 2021? Or another thing, and I mean, things are still really just coming in, but non-voters. I know that the AFD did really, really well back in 2017 because they were able to attract former non-voters. So, I mean, are they still doing so? So just maybe some thoughts on how voters have shifted their preferences.
That's the advantage of doing things online. I was able to look up some graphs about voter movements. What's interesting is that it's often said that elections in Germany are won in the center, which is a standing phrase that appears to be quite hollow at times. But still, what we can see is that, interestingly, and that speaks for the strategy or for the strategy of the SPD working out, is that the SPD was able to attract voters from the CDU. So the CDU lost a great amount of voters to the SPD, followed by the FDP, and not so much to the Greens. And that is kind of interesting, I would say. So it was pretty much a exchange between the big parties, this time to the advantage of the SPD. And that is also what we have seen in the past. It's oftentimes said that the SPD lost so many votes to the political left, which is true. But if we look at the net exchange in elections, it's mostly SPD versus CDU-CSU. So we're still focusing on these two former Volksparteien, right? At the same time, it's interesting to see that the CDU did not so much lose to the FDP as one would have expected. So the FDP presented itself as an alternative. If you're disappointed with Laschet, but still market liberal conservative, you can vote for us. The FDP came in with a pretty good result, but not as much as one could have thought. So it played out mostly to the advantage of the SPD. When it comes to non-voters, the AFD was not the party that was able to profit too much. I think we're at a point right now where there has been a decision has been made, whether you remain a non-voter or you got an alternative in the party system. And that at this point in time is the AFD. So I'm not surprised that also the camp of the non-voters has fortified in a way.
That's interesting. You know, I can't help but share a couple of the things that we learned when we were in Berlin on this study trip. one of them was this very fascinating finding that for the vast majority of German voters, I recall 70 to 75%, basically choosing the CDU, the SPD, the FDP, or the Greens, it was a wash. That the vast majority of voters could have switched between any or among any one of these four parties. And the conclusion is that the German electorate has never been so fluid. That was one of those kind of findings that just really seemed to kind of resonate. And it seems that the SPD was able to capitalize on that fluidity this time, but especially thanks to a particularly resonant candidate, at least for this particular election. There's also, on a similar note, we have a question here about a generational split or a generational divide. With an increasing, I guess, cleavage between the preferences of younger voters and the preference of older voters. I think there's some evidence of that, but of course I'd be interested in what our panelists think. But I also want to kind of point out something else that I remember hearing when we were in Berlin, which is that, everybody just assumes that the youngest voting group, that the younger generation is, all made up of Friday for Futures and little Greta Thunbergs, and many of them, of course, are. But I think that I saw a result that actually that youngest cohort preferred the FDP over the Greens. And it was pointed out that, younger generations of Germans are more small c conservative than maybe the media lets us believe sometimes. Although it's also true that older voters do like the SPD and the CDU as well. Oh, that was another little factoid that I remember coming across, that I think 38% of the electorate this year was over 65 years of old. So years of age. So it is an increasingly older electorate, and that's going to redound to the benefit of the CDU and the SPD, at least so far. But any other thoughts on the generational gap? Chantal, yes.
So I think the most popular parties for the under 30s were the FDP and the Greens, kind of going for similar electorates. And I think in that way, I think it's quite interesting because they seem to have such a influence in where the coalition negotiations are going to go. So given that the dominant stage of the electorate is actually considerably older, I think that's a nice balancing out in the result that we have this time around, that actually those parties that younger people have voted for will have, if either of these coalitions come about, have quite a role, and that might be a good thing. The reasons I heard for younger people voting FDP, I heard one anecdote that it was about the fact that the FDP were not as strict on mask use, and for young people who felt like they had lost part of their youth in the pandemic, that was an attractive prospect for them. And then similarly, outside of climate change, between the Greens and the FDP, they're certainly the two parties who are very big on digitalization. And we all know what the digital infrastructure in Germany is like. It's not very good. So I think standing in innovation in that respect kind of would attract to the younger voter base as well.
Sorry, Ed or Marcel, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Just very generally, I think what one has to keep in mind when we're looking at younger voters compared to older voters is we are looking at two types of party of voting behavior right here. So with older voters, we're looking at a relatively strong, comparatively relatively strong party identification. So we're looking at voters who always voted CDU, always voted SPD, and still voting SPD or CDU. But the strength of party identification becomes weaker the younger the voters are. So when we're looking at this result right now, this is just a cutout. This is just one point in time. And I totally agree with what Chantal said here. I think, especially with the FDP, and the young voters, we're looking at those who are disappointed by how the restrictions went on in the pandemic and so on. And I think that this result could change over time, pretty much.
All right, we're rapidly running out of time, but I want to get an institutional question out there too, kind of taking from what a lot of the folks are typing in the Q&A. So, I mean, it's obviously going to be a much more unwieldy German government with, three parties controlling different ministries and things like that. But Ed, I think that you had mentioned before that, like in foreign policy, for instance, how much wiggle room, how much autonomy is the foreign minister going to have if this person is really being more micromanaged out of the chancellery. But I think the other thing goes for the finance ministry. So it's been widely reported that if Lindner gets the finance ministry, then a lot of these, real ambitious spending plans, I think the Greens want 50 billion to invest in kind of green infrastructure and digitalization and things like that, right? But I mean, how much discretion, how much autonomy will the finance minister have if the chancellor says, no, we want more spending, we're going to suspend the debt brake, or we're going to violate the I guess it would be violated in the Constitution because they have written that in there. So I guess the kind of institutional question is, how much autonomy will ministers actually have? How much control will come from the chancellery? And will any of this matter for the big items, like how quickly the country is going to move to a carbon neutral economy? How much, if any, it's going to spend on infrastructure, which seems to be needed? If there's going to be more investment in kind of like pan-European debt or other kind of investments. So like, what are your thoughts on the kind of institutional competition that will take place?
Yeah, it's a great question, and without betraying confidences, speaking to officials in Berlin, they are really aware of this and really nervous about it. I think one reaction will be, if you're a Green, there's no earthly way that you are not going to tie down the environmental climate investment program in the coalition negotiations. You have to. You can't possibly just then say, oh, we'll pass. We'll go look at that later, and we'll ask Christian Lindner what he wants to do. And I think that will apply in quite a few areas of policy which are more contested. So I think the coalition negotiations in Germany are always important. They're going to be even more important in this circumstance. Of course, events then come up, and then you have to respond. Chancellery is going to be really, really strong. That will also reflect. I guess the sort of if you end up with the traffic light coalition, Scholz's mandate, I think for the US certainly or anyone else, you would need to engage all of the parties. But I think also what people have been doing, and it's shrewd, is looking at where key officials around Scholz might go. Many people speculate, for example, that Wolfgang Schmidt, previously State Secretary of the Finance Ministry, will be his Chancellery Minister, and will do a lot of the heavy lifting on coordination and be a really, really key figure. So, those are just a few thoughts.
Marcel or Chantal, any thoughts on the institutional aspect?
Chantal, if you want to go first, I don't want to take your time. Okay. Well, just very quick, I think the role of the Minister of Finance depends on the, let me put it this way, ideological proximity to the Chancellor, or the way in which they are able to agree on certain key policies. And that is something that might be relatively high in the beginning because they're operating on a coalition treaty, but that can, depending on the events to come, diminish over time. So although it might not happen, and I'm pretty sure it won't happen because the FDP will claim the Ministry of Finance for themselves, which is totally in line with their ideology, of course. It might be more useful for Chancellor Scholz, or more convenient for Chancellor Scholz, to have a Minister of Finance that comes from the Greens and is more ready not to use their veto, because a Minister of Finance has a veto in the cabinet when it comes to budget questions, than having a Minister of Finance from the FDP. But that won't work out. So I think since that is the case, we're in a traffic light coalition, although it's the more feasible coalition right now politically. I think we're also looking at potential conflict between an SPD chancellor, as moderate as they may be, and the Greens, and the Minister of Finance from the FDP.
Art, we've come to basically the end of our time. There's lots of other questions in here that we could have gotten in here. There was one about the influence of QAnon and the Querdenker. I personally think that was pretty minimal this time around. And there was this radical party, what was it called, Die Basis, that did like really, really poorly. And now there's all sorts of infighting there. So I guess luckily, There seems to be very little influence there. There's a question about how new citizens voted. I don't think that I've seen any data on that yet. I think we'll probably have to wait for more detailed data to come out. I do want to note for everybody, though, that perhaps some of our audience remembers we had this terrific webinar with a candidate for a Wahlkreis in Frankfurt, Armand Zorn, who's also a German with a migration background, having come from Africa originally, and he won his race. So, you know, we had a webinar with a winning, you know, Bundestag candidate, which I think is pretty cool. I also know that there are the first 2 transgender members of the Bundestag who have been elected, and I know that that's a huge thing for many Germans, but especially Germans in the LGBTQ plus community. So we'll also have to look at data on how diverse the new Bundestag will be. A lot of the parties, as we saw, had nominated more women than before, especially the FDP and the CSU, which had been lagging other mainstream parties. But we'll see how many women actually made it in, as well as how many Germans with a migration background or Germans of color. So, you know, it seems like we already know what our next webinar in November is going to be, when we have more detailed data on all this stuff. So stay tuned for that. And we'll certainly also want to do something on the next coalition once we have a better idea of that. But we've come to time. I want to thank our 3 panelists, Ed, Chantal, and Marcel, for taking time out of their busy schedules, or in my case, dealing with horrible jet lag, having just come back from Germany last night. So thanks to all the people who have Zoomed in, and we'll talk soon about this very important and momentous result. Bye, everyone.